George Washington was the very first president, and he loved his life at Mount Vernon so much that he took great care of his horses and his money even after the war ended. John Adams was the second president, and even when people laughed at his stiff and serious style, he never lost his cool, standing tall through every storm. Thomas Jefferson was the third president, and he was so hungry for knowledge that he traveled across Europe just to learn new farming secrets and bring them home. James Madison was the fourth president, and even though he stood at just 5 feet 4 inches, the smallest president ever, his mind was a giant that helped shape a whole nation. James Monroe was the fifth president, and his name will always be tied to the bold Monroe Doctrine, a warning shot that told the world America was here to stay. John Quincy Adams was the sixth president, and behind closed doors, he was a caring father who spent his evenings teaching his children to see the world with wonder. Andrew Jackson was the seventh president, a fierce war hero known as Old Hickory, tough as the wood he was named after. Martin Van Buren was the eighth president, and he was the very first president to be born as an American citizen, not a British subject. William Henry Harrison was the ninth president, and tragically, he served the shortest term in history, just 31 days before he passed away. John Tyler was the 10th president, and he fathered 15 children, more than any other president in American history. James K. Polk was the 11th president, and he worked so hard and so relentlessly that many believe the stress of the job wore his body down soon after he left office. Zachary Taylor was the 12th president, a battle-hardened general who had never even voted in a presidential election before winning one himself. Millard Fillmore was the 13th president, and he was the last president to belong to the Whig Party before it crumbled away. Franklin Pierce was the 14th president, and his presidency was shadowed by deep personal grief after losing his young son just before taking office. James Buchanan was the 15th president, and he remains the only president in American history who never married. Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president, and he guided the nation through its darkest hour, the Civil War, before his life was tragically cut short. Andrew Johnson was the 17th president, and he became the first president to ever face impeachment, surviving by just a single vote. Ulysses S. Grant was the 18th president, a legendary general who once led the entire Union Army to victory before ever stepping into the White House. Rutherford B. Hayes was the 19th president, and his election was so disputed that a special commission had to decide the winner. James Garfield was the 20th president, and his life was tragically ended by an assassin just months into his term. Chester Arthur was the 21st president, and he surprised everyone by becoming a champion for reforming the very government job system he once benefited from. Grover Cleveland was the 22nd president, and he bravely got married right inside the White House, the only president to ever do so. Benjamin Harrison was the 23rd president, and during his term, the White House got its very first electric lights installed. Grover Cleveland returned as the 24th president, making history as the only person to serve 2 separate, non-consecutive terms. William McKinley was the 25th president, and his life ended when he was shot by an assassin while greeting the public at a fair. Theodore Roosevelt was the 26th president, a bold adventurer who became the youngest man to ever hold the office. William Howard Taft was the 27th president, and he later became the only president to also serve as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Woodrow Wilson was the 28th president, and he guided the nation through the fire and fury of World War I. Warren G. Harding was the 29th president, and his term was shaken by scandal even though he was known for his warm, friendly charm. Calvin Coolidge was the 30th president, and he earned the nickname Silent Cal because he spoke so few words in public. Herbert Hoover was the 31st president, and he faced the crushing weight of the Great Depression just as it began to swallow the nation. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the 32nd president, and he led America through the Great Depression and World War II, serving longer than any president in history. Harry S. Truman was the 33rd president, and he made the heavy decision to end World War II by using the atomic bomb. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the 34th president, a five-star general who once commanded the massive D-Day invasion before leading the country. John F. Kennedy was the 35th president, and his bright vision for America was tragically cut short by an assassin's bullet. Lyndon B. Johnson was the 36th president, and he pushed hard to pass landmark civil rights laws that changed the nation forever. Richard Nixon was the 37th president, and he became the only president in history to resign from office. Gerald Ford was the 38th president, and he is the only man to become president without ever being elected president or vice president. Jimmy Carter was the 39th president, and after leaving office, he spent decades building homes for the poor and working for peace around the world. Ronald Reagan was the 40th president, a former Hollywood actor whose powerful speeches helped bring the Cold War to its final chapter. George H.W. Bush was the 41st president, and he led the nation to victory in the Gulf War, a swift and stunning military campaign. Bill Clinton was the 42nd president, and during his years in office, the American economy boomed with incredible growth and job creation. George W. Bush was the 43rd president, and he led the country through the terrifying aftermath of the September 11 attacks. Barack Obama was the 44th president, and he made history as the first African American to ever hold the office. Donald Trump was the 45th president, a billionaire businessman who stormed into politics without ever holding office before. Joe Biden was the 46th president, and at his inauguration, he became the oldest person ever to take the presidential oath. Donald Trump returned as the 47th president, becoming only the second man in history to win two separate, non-consecutive terms in the White House.